Relax and listen to the voice. The Metal Pig. In the city of Florence, not far from the Piazza del Granduca, runs a little street called Porta Rossa. In this street, just in front of the marketplace where vegetables are sold, stands a pig made of brass and curiously formed. The bright color has been changed by age to a dark green, but clear, fresh water pours from the snout, which shines as if it had been polished. And so indeed it has, for hundreds of poor people and children seize it in their hands as they place their mouths close to the mouth of the animal to drink. It is quite a picture to see a half-naked boy clasping the well-formed creature by the head as he presses his rosy lips against its jaws. Everyone who visits Florence can very quickly find the place. He has only to ask the first beggar he meets for the metal pig, and he will be told where it is. It was late on a winter evening. The mountains were covered with snow, but the moon shone brightly, and moonlight in Italy is like a dull winter's day in the north. Indeed, it is better, for clear air seems to raise us above the earth, while in the north, a cold, gray, leaden sky appears to press us down to earth, even as the cold, damp earth shall one day press on us in the grave. In the garden of the Grand Duke's palace, under the roof of one of the wings, where 1,000 roses bloom in summer, a little ragged boy had been sitting the whole day long, a boy who might serve as a type of Italy, lovely and smiling, and yet still suffering. He was hungry and thirsty, yet no one gave him anything, and when it became dark, and they were about to close the gardens, the porter turned him out. He stood a long time musing on the bridge which crosses the Arno, and looking at the glittering stars, reflected in the water which flowed between him and the elegant marble bridge della Trinita. He then walked away towards the metal pig, half knelt down, clasped it with his arms, and then put his mouth to the shining snout and drank deep draughts of the fresh water. Close by lay a few salad leaves and 2 chestnuts, which were to serve for his supper. No one was in the street but himself. It belonged only to him, so he boldly seated himself on the pig's back, leaned forward so that his curly head could rest on the head of the animal, and before he was aware, he had fallen asleep. It was midnight. The metal pig raised himself gently, and the boy heard him say quite distinctly, "Hold on, little boy, for I am going to run." And away he started for a most wonderful ride. First they arrived at the Piazza del Granduca, and the metal horse which bears the Duke's statue neighed aloud. The painted coats of arms on the old council house shone like transparent pictures, and Michelangelo's David tossed his sling. It was as if everything had life. The metallic groups of figures, among which were Perseus and the Rape of the Sabines, looked like living persons, and cries of terror sounded from them all across the noble square. By the Palazzo degli Uffizi, in the arcade, where the nobility assemble for the carnival, the metal pig stopped. "Hold fast," said the animal. "Hold fast, for I'm going upstairs." The little boy said not a word. He was half pleased and half afraid. They entered a long gallery where the boy had been before. The walls were resplendent with paintings. Here stood statues and busts, all in a clear light as if it were day. But the grandest appeared when the door of a side room opened. The little boy could remember what beautiful things he had seen there, but tonight everything shone in its brightest colors. Here stood the figure of a beautiful woman, as beautifully sculptured as possible by one of the great masters. Her graceful limbs appeared to move, dolphins sprang at her feet, and immortality shone from her eyes. The world called her the Venus de Medici. By her side were statues, in which the spirit of life breathed in stone, figures of men, one of whom whetted his sword and was named the Grinder. Wrestling gladiators formed another group. The sword had been sharpened for them, and they strove for the goddess of beauty. The boy was dazzled by so much glitter, for the walls were gleaming with bright colors. All appeared living reality. As they passed from hall to hall, beauty everywhere showed itself, and as the metal pig went step by step from one picture to the other, the little boy could see it all plainly. One glory eclipsed another, yet there was one picture that fixed itself on the little boy's memory, more especially because of the happy children in it represented, for these the little boy had seen in daylight. Many passed by this picture with indifference, and yet it contains a treasure of poetic feeling. It represents Christ descending into Hades. They are not the lost whom the spectator sees, but the heathen of olden times. The Florentine Angiolo Bronzino painted this picture. Most beautiful is the expression on the face of the two children, who appear to have full confidence that they shall reach heaven at last. They are embracing each other, and one little one stretches out his hand towards another who stands below him, and points to himself as if he were saying, "I am going to heaven." The older people stand as if uncertain, yet hopeful, and they bow in humble adoration to the Lord Jesus. On this picture, the boy's eyes rested longer than on any other. The metal pig stood still before it. A low sigh was heard. Did it come from the picture or from the animal? The boy raised his hands towards the smiling children, and then the pig ran off with him through the open vestibule.
Thank you, you beautiful animal,"
said the little boy, caressing the metal pig as it ran down the steps. "Well, thanks to yourself also," replied the metal pig. "I have helped you, and you have helped me, for it is only when I have an innocent child on my back that I receive the power to run. Yes, as you see, I can even venture under the rays of the lamp in front of the picture of the Madonna, but I may not enter the church. Still, from without, and while you are upon my back, I may look in through the open door. Do not get down yet, for if you do, then I shall be lifeless, as you have seen me in the Porta Rosa."
"I will stay with you, my dear creature,"
said the little boy. So then they went on at a rapid pace through the streets of Florence, till they came to the square before the church of Santa Croce. The folding doors flew open, and light streamed from the altar through the church into the deserted square. A wonderful blaze of light streamed from one of the monuments in the left side aisle, and 1,000 moving stars seemed to form a glory round it. Even the coat of arms on the tombstone shone, and a red ladder on a blue field gleamed like fire. It was the grave of Galileo. The monument is unadorned, but the red ladder is an emblem of art, signifying that the way to glory leads up a shining ladder, on which the prophets of mind rise to heaven, like Elias of old. In the right aisle of the church, every statue on the richly carved sarcophagi seemed endowed with life. Here stood Michelangelo, there Dante, with the laurel wreath round his brow, Alfieri and Machiavelli, for here side by side rest the great men, the pride of Italy. The church itself is very beautiful, even more beautiful than the marble cathedral at Florence, though not so large. It seemed as if the carved vestments stirred, and as if the marble figures they covered raised their heads higher to gaze upon the brightly colored glowing altar where the white-robed boys swung the golden censers amid music and song, while the strong fragrance of incense filled the church and streamed forth into the square. The boy reached forth his hands towards the light, and at the same moment the metal pig started again so rapidly that he was obliged to cling tightly to him. The wind whistled in his ears. He heard the church door creak on its hinges as it closed, and it seemed to him as if he had lost his senses. Then a cold shudder passed over him, and he awoke. It was morning. The metal pig stood in its old place on the Portorosa, and the boy found he had slipped nearly off of its back. Fear and trembling came upon him as he thought of his mother. She had sent him out the day before to get some money. He had not done so, and now he was hungry and thirsty. Once more he clasped the neck of his metal horse, kissed its nose, and nodded farewell to it. Then he wandered away into one of the narrowest streets, where there was scarcely room for a loaded donkey to pass. A great iron-bound door stood ajar. He passed through and climbed up a brick staircase with dirty walls and a rope for a balustrade, till he came to an open gallery hung with rags. From here, a flight of steps led down to a court, where from a well water was drawn up by iron rollers to the different stories of the house, and where the water buckets hung side by side. Sometimes the roller and the bucket danced in the air, splashing the water all over the court. Another broken-down staircase led from the gallery, and 2 Russian sailors running down it almost upset the poor boy. They were coming from their nightly carousel. A woman, not very young, with an unpleasant face and a quantity of black hair, followed them.
"What have you brought home?"
she asked when she saw the boy.
"Don't be angry," he pleaded. "I received nothing. I have nothing at all."
And he seized his mother's dress and would have kissed it. Then they went into a little room. I need not describe it, but only say that there stood in it an earthen pot with handles made for holding fire, which in Italy is called a marito. This pot she took in her lap, warmed her fingers, and pushed the boy with her elbow.
"Certainly you must have some money,"
she said. The boy began to cry, and then she struck him with her foot till he cried out louder.
"Will you be quiet, or I'll break your screaming head?"
And she swung about the fire pot which she held in her hand, while the boy crouched to the earth and screamed. Then a neighbor came in, and she also had a marito under her arm. "Felicita," she said, "what are you doing to the child?"
"The child is mine,"
she answered.
"I can murder him if I like, and you too, Giannina."
And then she swung about the fire pot. The other woman lifted up hers to defend herself, and the 2 pots clashed together so violently that they were dashed to pieces, and fire and ashes flew about the room. The boy rushed out at the sight, sped across the courtyard, and fled from the house. The poor child ran till he was quite out of breath, and at last stopped at the church, the doors of which were opened to him the night before, and went in. Here everything was bright, and the boy knelt down by the first tomb on his right, the grave of Michelangelo, and sobbed as if his heart would break. People came and went. Mass was performed, but no one noticed the boy, excepting an elderly citizen who stood still and looked at him for a moment, and then went away like the rest. Hunger and thirst overpowered the child, and he became quite faint and ill. At last he crept into a corner behind the marble monuments and went to sleep. Towards evening he was awakened by a pull at his sleeve. He started up, and the same old citizen stood before him. "Are you ill? Where do you live? Have you been here all day?" were some of the questions asked by the old man. After hearing his answers, the old man took him home to a small house close by in a back street. They entered a glovemaker's shop, where a woman sat sewing busily. A little white poodle, so closely shaven that his pink skin could plainly be seen, frisked about the room and gamboled upon the boy.
"Innocent souls are soon intimate,"
said the woman as she caressed both the boy and the dog. These good people gave the child food and drink, and said he should stay with them all night, and that the next day the old man, who was called Giuseppe, would go and speak to his mother. A little homely bed was prepared for him, but to him, who had so often slept on the hard stones, it was a royal couch, and he slept sweetly and dreamed of the splendid pictures and of the metal pig. Giuseppe went out the next morning, and the poor child was not glad to see him go, for he knew that the old man was gone to his mother, and that, perhaps, he would have to go back. He wept at the thought, and then he played with the little lively dog and kissed it, while the old woman looked kindly at him to encourage him. And what news did Giuseppe bring back? At first the boy could not hear, for he talked a great deal to his wife, and she nodded and stroked the boy's cheek. Then she said,
"He is a good lad. He shall stay with us. He may become a clever glove maker, like you. Look what delicate fingers he has got. Madonna intended him for a glove maker."
So the boy stayed with them, and the woman herself taught him to sew, and he ate well and slept well, and became very merry. But at last he began to tease Bellissima, as the dog was called. This made the woman angry, and she scolded him and threatened him, which made him very unhappy, and he went and sat in his own room full of sad thoughts. This chamber looked upon the street, in which hung skins to dry, and there were thick iron bars across his window. That night he lay awake, thinking of the metal pig. Indeed, it was always in his thoughts. Suddenly he fancied he heard feet outside going pit-a-pat. He sprang out of bed and went to the window. Could it be the metal pig? But there was nothing to be seen. Whatever he had heard had passed already. Next morning, their neighbor, the artist, passed by, carrying a paint box and a large roll of canvas.
"Help the gentleman to carry his box of colors,"
said the woman to the boy, and he obeyed instantly, took the box, and followed the painter. They walked on until they reached the great picture gallery and mounted the same staircase up which he had ridden that night on the metal pig. He remembered all the statues and pictures with beautiful marble Venus, and again he looked at the Madonna with the Savior and St. John. They stopped before the picture by Bronzino, in which Christ is represented as standing in the lower world, with the children smiling before him in the sweet expectation of entering heaven, and the poor boy smiled too, for here was his heaven. "You may go home now," said the painter, while the boy stood watching him till he had set up his easel.
"May I see you paint?"
asked the boy.
"May I see you put the picture on this white canvas?"
"I am not going to paint yet," replied the artist. Then he brought out a piece of chalk. His hand moved quickly, and his eye measured the great picture, and though nothing appeared but a faint line, the figure of the Savior was as clearly visible as in the colored picture. "Why don't you go?" said the painter, and then the boy wandered home silently and seated himself on the table and learned to sew gloves. But all day long his thoughts were in the picture gallery, and so he pricked his fingers and was awkward. But he did not tease Bellissima. When evening came and the house door stood open, he slipped out. It was a bright, beautiful, starlit evening, but rather cold. Away he went through the already deserted streets, and soon came to the metal pig. He stooped down and kissed its shining nose, and then seated himself on its back.
"You happy creature," he said. "How I have longed for you. We must take a ride tonight."
But the metal pig lay motionless, while the fresh stream gushed forth from its mouth. The little boy still sat astride on its back when he felt something pulling at his clothes. He looked down, and there was Bellissima, little smooth-shaven Bellissima, barking as if she would have said, "Here I am too. Why are you sitting there?" A fiery dragon could not have frightened the little boy so much as did the little dog in this place.
"Bellissima in the street, and not dressed,"
as the old lady called it,
What would be the end of this?
The dog never went out in the winter, unless she was attired in a little lambskin coat which had been made for her. It was fastened round the little dog's neck and body with red ribbons, and was decorated with rosettes and little bells. The dog looked almost like a little kid when she was allowed to go out in winter and trot after her mistress. And now here she was in the cold, and not dressed. Oh, how would it end? All his fancies were quickly put to flight, yet he kissed the metal pig once more, and then took Bellissima in his arms. The poor little thing trembled so with cold that the boy ran homeward as fast as he could. "What are you running away with there?" asked two of the police whom he met, and at whom the dog barked. "Where have you stolen that pretty dog?" they asked, and they took it away from him.
"Oh, I have not stolen it. Do give it me back again," cried the boy despairingly.
"If you have not stolen it, you may say at home that they can send to the watch-house for the dog." Then they told him where the watch-house was, and went away with Bellissima. Here was a dreadful trouble. The boy did not know whether he had better jump into the Arno, or go home and confess everything. They would certainly kill him, he thought.
"Well, I would gladly be killed," he reasoned, "for then I shall die and go to heaven."
And so he went home, almost hoping for death. The door was locked, and he could not reach the knocker. No one was in the street, so he took up a stone, and with it made a tremendous noise at the door.
"Who is there?"
asked somebody from within.
"It is I," said he. "Bellissima is gone. Open the door, and then kill me."
Then indeed there was a great panic. Madame was so very fond of Bellissima. She immediately looked at the wall where the dog's dress usually hung, and there was the little lambskin.
"Bellissima is in the watch-house,"
she cried.
"You bad boy! How did you entice her out? Poor delicate little thing, with those rough policemen, and she'll be frozen with cold."
Giuseppe went off at once, while his wife lamented, and the boy wept. Several of the neighbors came in, and amongst them the painter. He took the boy between his knees and questioned him, and in broken sentences he soon heard the whole story, and also about the metal pig, and the wonderful ride to the picture gallery, which was certainly rather incomprehensible. The painter, however, consoled the little boy, and tried to soften the lady's anger, but she would not be pacified till her husband returned with Bellissima, who had been with the police. Then there was a great rejoicing, and the painter caressed the boy, and gave him a number of pictures. Oh, what beautiful pictures these were! Figures with funny heads, and, above all, the metal pig was there too. Oh, nothing could be more delightful. By means of a few strokes, it was made to appear on the paper, and even the house that stood behind it had been sketched in. Oh, if he could only draw and paint! He who could do this could conjure all the world before him. The first leisure moment during the next day, the boy got a pencil, and on the back of one of the other drawings, he attempted to copy the drawing of the metal pig, and he succeeded. Certainly, it was rather crooked, rather up and down, one leg thick and another thin. Still, it was like the copy, and he was overjoyed at what he had done. The pencil would not go quite as it ought. He had found that out, but the next day he tried again. The second pig was drawn by the side of the first, and this looked 100 times better, and the third attempt was so good that everybody might know what it was meant to represent. And now the glove-making went on, but slowly. The orders given by the shops in the town were not finished quickly, For the metal pig had taught the boy that all objects may be drawn upon paper, and Florence is a picture book in itself for anyone who chooses to turn over its pages. On the Piazza del Trinita stands a slender pillar, and upon it is the goddess of justice, blindfolded, with her scales in her hand. She was soon represented on paper, and it was the glovemaker's boy who had placed her there. His collection of pictures increased, but as yet they were only copies of lifeless objects, when one day Bellissima came gambolling before him.
"Stand still," cried he, "and I will draw you beautifully to put amongst my collection."
But Bellissima would not stand still, so she must be bound fast in one position. He tied her head and tail, but she barked and jumped, and so pulled and tightened the string that she was nearly strangled, and just then her mistress walked in.
"You wicked boy! The poor little creature!"
was all she could utter. She pushed the boy from her, thrust him away with her foot, called him a most ungrateful, good-for-nothing, wicked boy, and forbade him to enter the house again. Then she wept, and kissed her little half-strangled Bellissima. At this moment the painter entered the room. In the year 1834, there was an exhibition in the Academy of Arts at Florence. Two pictures, placed side by side, attracted a large number of spectators. The smaller of the two represented a little boy sitting at a table, drawing. Before him was a little white poodle, curiously shaven, but as the animal would not stand still, it had been fastened with a string to its head and tail to keep it in one position. The truthfulness and life in this picture interested everyone. The painter was said to be a young Florentine who had been found in the streets when just a child by an old glove-maker who had brought him up. The boy had taught himself to draw, and it was also said that a young artist, now famous, had discovered talent in the child just as he was about to be sent away for having tied up Madame's favorite little dog and using it as a model. The glove-maker's boy had also become a great painter, as the picture proved, but the larger picture by its side was still greater proof of his talent. It represented a handsome boy, clothed in rags, lying asleep, and leaning against the metal pig in the street of the Porta Rosa. All the spectators knew the spot well. The child's arms were round the neck of the pig, and he was in a deep sleep. The lamp before the picture of the Madonna threw a strong, effective light on the pale, delicate face of the child. It was a beautiful picture. A large gilt frame surrounded it, and on one corner of the frame a laurel wreath had been hung, but a black band, twined unseen among the green leaves, and a streamer of crape hung down from it, for within the last few days the young artist had died. The Shepherd's Story of the Bond of Friendship. The little dwelling in which we lived was of clay, but the doorposts were columns of fluted marble found near the spot on which it stood. The roof sloped nearly to the ground. It was at this time dark, brown and ugly, but had originally been formed of blooming olive and laurel branches, brought from beyond the mountains. The house was situated in a narrow gorge, whose rocky walls rose to a perpendicular height, naked and black, while round their summits clouds often hung, looking like white living figures. Not a singing bird was ever heard there, neither did men dance to the sound of the pipe. The spot was once sacred to olden times. Even its name recalled a memory of the days when it was called Delphi. Then the summits of the dark, sacred mountains were covered with snow, and the highest, Mount Parnassus, glowed longest in the red evening light. The brook which rolled from it near our house was also sacred. How well I can remember every spot in that deep, sacred solitude. A fire had been kindled in the midst of the hut, and while the hot ashes lay there red and glowing, the bread was baked in them. At times the snow would be piled so high around our hut as almost to hide it, and then my mother appeared most cheerful. She would hold my head between her hands and sing the songs she never sang at other times, for the Turks, our masters, would not allow it. She sang,
On the summit of Mount Olympus, in a forest of dwarf firs, lay an old stag. His eyes were heavy with tears, and glittering with colors like dewdrops. And there came by a roebuck, and said, What aileth thee, that thou weepest blue and red tears? And the stag answered, The Turk has come to our city. He has wild dogs for the chase, a goodly pack. I will drive them away across the islands, cried the young roebuck. I will drive them away across the islands into the deep sea. But before evening the roebuck was slain, and before night the hunted stag was dead.
and when my mother sang thus, her eyes would become moist, and on the long eyelashes were tears, but she concealed them and watched the black bread baking in the ashes. Then I would clench my fist and cry,
We will kill these Turks.
but she repeated the words of the song. I will drive them across the islands to the deep sea. But before evening came, the roebuck was slain, and before the night, the hunted stag was dead. We had been lonely in our hut for several days and nights when my father came home. I knew he would bring me some shells from the Gulf of Lepanto, or perhaps a knife with a shining blade. This time he brought, under his sheepskin cloak, a little child, a little half-naked girl. She was wrapped in fur, but when this was taken off and she lay in my mother's lap, 3 silver coins were found fastened in her dark hair. They were all her possessions. My father told us that the child's parents had been killed by the Turks, and he talked so much about them that I dreamed of the Turks all night. He himself had been wounded, and my mother bound up his arm. It was a deep wound, and the thick sheepskin cloak was stiff with congealed blood. The little maiden was to be my sister. How pretty and bright she looked. Even my mother's eyes were not more gentle than hers. Anastasia, as she was called, was to be my sister, because her father had been united to mine by an old custom which we still follow. They had sworn brotherhood in their youth, and the most beautiful and virtuous maiden in the neighborhood was chosen to perform the act of consecration upon this bond of friendship. So now this little girl was my sister. She sat in my lap, and I brought her flowers and feathers from the birds of the mountain. We drank together of the waters of Parnassus, and dwelt for many years beneath the laurel roof of the hut, while winter after winter my mother sang her song of the stag who shed red tears. But as yet I did not understand that the sorrows of my own countrymen were mirrored in those tears. One day there came to our hut Franks, men from a far country, whose dress was different to ours. They had tents and beds with them, carried by horses, and they were accompanied by more than 20 Turks, all armed with swords and muskets. These Franks were friends of the Pacha, who had letters from him, commanding an escort for them. They only came to see our mountain, to ascend Parnassus amid the snow and clouds, and to look at the strange black rocks which raised their steep sides near our hut. They could not find room in the hut, nor endure the smoke that rolled along the ceiling till it found its way out at the low door, so they pitched their tents on a small space outside of our dwelling. Roasted lambs and birds were brought forth, and strong, sweet wine, of which the Turks are forbidden to partake. When they departed, I accompanied them for some distance, carrying my little sister Anastasia, wrapped in a goatskin, on my back. One of the Frankish gentlemen made me stand in front of a rock, and drew us both as we stood there, so that we looked like one creature. I did not think of it then, but Anastasia and I were really one. She was always sitting on my lap, or riding in the goatskin on my back, and in my dreams she always appeared to me. 2 nights after this, other men, armed with knives and muskets, came into our tent. They were Albanians, brave men, my mother told me. They only stayed a short time. My sister Anastasia sat on the knee of one of them, and when they were gone, she had not 3, but 2 silver coins in her hair. One had disappeared. They wrapped tobacco in strips of paper and smoked it, and I remember they were uncertain as to the road they ought to take. But they were obliged to go at last, and my father went with them. Soon after, we heard the sound of firing. The noise continued, and presently soldiers rushed into our hut and took my mother and myself and Anastasia prisoners. They declared that we had entertained robbers, and that my father had acted as their guide, and therefore we must now go with them. The corpses of the robbers, and my father's corpse, were brought into the hut. I saw my poor dead father, and I cried till I fell asleep. When I awoke, I found myself in a prison, but the room was not worse than our own in the hut. They gave me onions and musty wine from a tarred cask, but we were not accustomed to much better fare at home. How long we were kept in prison, I do not know, but many days and nights passed by. We were set free about Easter time. I carried Anastasia on my back, and we walked very slowly, for my mother was very weak, and it is a long way to the sea, to the Gulf of Lepanto. On our arrival, we entered a church, in which there were beautiful pictures in golden frames. They were pictures of angels, fair and bright, and yet our little Anastasia looked equally beautiful, as it seemed to me. In the center of the floor stood a coffin filled with roses. My mother told me it was the Lord Jesus Christ who was represented by these roses. Then the priest announced, "Christ is risen!" and all the people greeted each other. Each one carried a burning taper in his hand, and one was given to me, as well as to little Anastasia. The music sounded, and the people left the church hand in hand with joy and gladness. Outside, the women were roasting the paschal lamb. We were invited to partake, and as I sat by the fire, a boy, older than myself, put his arms round my neck and kissed me and said, "Christ is risen!" And thus it was that, for the first time, I met Aftanides. My mother could make fishermen's nets, for which there was a great demand here in the bay, and we lived a long time by the side of the sea, the beautiful sea that had a taste like tears, and in its colors reminded me of the stag that wept red tears, for sometimes its waters were red, and sometimes green or blue. Aftanides knew how to manage our boat, and I often sat in it with my little Anastasia while it glided on through the water, swift as a bird flying through the air. Then when the sun set, how beautifully, deeply blue would be the tint on the mountains, one rising above the other in the far distance, and the summit of Mount Parnassus rising above them all like a glorious crown. Its top glittered in the evening rays like molten gold, and it seemed as if the light came from within it, for long after the sun had sunk beneath the horizon, the mountain top would glow in the clear blue sky. The white aquatic birds skimmed the surface of the water in their flight, and all was calm and still as amid the black rocks at Delphi. I lay on my back in the boat. Anastasia leaned against me, while the stars above us glittered more brightly than the lamps in our church. They were the same stars, and in the same position over me as when I used to sit in front of our hut at Delphi, and I had almost begun to fancy I was still there, when suddenly there was a splash in the water. Anastasia had fallen in, but in a moment, Aphrodite had sprung in after her and was now holding her up to me. We dried her clothes as well as we were able, and remained on the water till they were dry, for we did not wish it to be known what a fright we had had, nor the danger which our little adopted sister had incurred, in whose life Aphrodite had now a part. The summer came, and the burning heat of the sun tinted the leaves of the trees with lines of gold. I thought of our cool mountain home, and the fresh water that flowed near it. My mother, too, longed for it, and one evening we wandered towards home. How peaceful and silent it was as we walked on through the thick, wild thyme, still fragrant though the sun had scorched the leaves. Not a single herdsman did we meet, not a solitary hut did we pass. Everything appeared lonely and deserted. Only a shooting star showed that in the heavens there was yet life. I know not whether the clear blue atmosphere gleamed with its own light, or if the radiance came from the stars, but we could distinguish quite plainly the outline of the mountains. My mother lighted a fire, and roasted some roots she had brought with her, and I and my little sister slept among the bushes, without fear of the ugly Smidraki, from whose throat issues fire, or of the wolf and the jackal, for my mother sat by us, and I considered her presence sufficient protection. We reached our old home, but the cottage was in ruins, and we had to build a new one. With the aid of some neighbors, chiefly women, the walls were in a few days erected, and very soon covered with the roof of olive branches. My mother obtained a living making bottle cases of bark and skins, and I kept the sheep belonging to the priests, who were sometimes peasants, while I had for my playfellows Anastasia and the turtles. Once our beloved Aphrodite paid us a visit. He said he had been longing to see us so much, and he remained with us 2 whole happy days. A month afterwards he came again to wish us goodbye, and brought with him a large fish for my mother. He told us he was going in a ship to Corfu and Patras, and could relate a great many stories, not only about the fishermen who lived near the Gulf of Lepanto, but also of kings and heroes who had once possessed Greece, just as the Turks possessed it now. I have seen a bud on a rose bush gradually, in the course of a few weeks, unfold its leaves till it became a rose in all its beauty, and before I was aware of it, I beheld it blooming in rosy loveliness. The same thing had happened to Anastasia. Unnoticed by me, she had gradually become a beautiful maiden, and I was now also a stout, strong youth. The wolfskins that covered the bed in which my mother and Anastasia slept had been taken from wolves which I had myself shot. Years had gone by when one evening Aphrodite came back. He had grown tall and slender as a reed, with strong limbs and a dark brown skin. He kissed us all, and had so much to tell of what he had seen of the great ocean, of the fortifications at Malta, and of the marvelous sepulchres of Egypt, that I looked up to him with a kind of veneration. His stories were as strange as the legends of the priests of olden times.
"How much you know!" I exclaimed. "And what wonders you can relate!"
"I think what you once told me the finest of all," he replied. "You told me of a thing that has never been out of my thoughts, of the good old custom of the bond of friendship, a custom I should like to follow. Brother, let you and I go to church, as your father and Anastasia's father once did. Your sister Anastasia is the most beautiful and most innocent of maidens, and she shall consecrate the deed. No people have such grand old customs as we Greeks." Anastasia blushed like a young rose, and my mother kissed Aphantides. At about 2 miles from our cottage, where the earth on a hill is sheltered by a few scattered trees, stood the little church, with a silver lamp hanging before the altar. I put on my best clothes, and the white tunic fell in graceful folds over my hips. The red jacket fitted tight and close. The tassel on my fez cap was of silver, and in my girdle glittered a knife and my pistols. Aphantides was clad in the blue dress worn by the Greek sailors. On his breast hung a silver medal with the figure of the Virgin Mary, and his scarf was as costly as those worn by rich lords. Everyone could see that we were about to perform a solemn ceremony. When we entered the little unpretending church, the evening sunlight streamed through the open door on the burning lamp and glittered on the golden picture frames. We knelt down together on the altar steps, and Anastasia drew near and stood beside us. A long, white garment fell in graceful folds over her delicate form, and on her white neck and bosom hung a chain entwined with old and new coins, forming a kind of collar. Her black hair was fastened into a knot, and confined by a headdress formed of gold and silver coins, which had been found in an ancient temple. No Greek girl had more beautiful ornaments than these. Her countenance glowed, and her eyes were like 2 stars. We all 3 offered a silent prayer, and then she said to us,
"Will you be friends in life and in death?"
"Yes," we replied.
"Will you each remember to say, whatever may happen, my brother is a part of myself. His secret is my secret. My happiness is his. Self-sacrifice, patience. Everything belongs to me as they do to him?"
And we again answered, "Yes." Then she joined out hands and kissed us on the forehead, and we again prayed silently. After this, a priest came through a door near the altar and blessed us all 3. Then a song was sung by other holy men behind the altar screen, and the bond of eternal friendship was confirmed. When we arose, I saw my mother standing by the church door, weeping. How cheerful everything seemed now in our little cottage by the Delphian Springs. On the evening before his departure, Aphantides sat thoughtfully beside me on the slopes of the mountain. His arm was flung around me, and mine was around his neck. We spoke of the sorrows of Greece, and of the men of the country who could be trusted. Every thought of our souls lay clear before us. Presently I seized his hand.
"Aphantides," I exclaimed, "there is one thing still that you must know, one thing that till now has been a secret between myself and heaven. My whole soul is filled with a love stronger than the love I bear to my mother and to thee."
"And to whom do you love?" asked Aphantides, and his face and neck grew red as fire.
"I love Anastasia," I replied.
Then his hand trembled in mine, and he became pale as a corpse. I saw it, I understood the cause, and I believe my hand trembled too. I bent towards him, I kissed his forehead and whispered, "I have never spoken of this to her, and perhaps she does not love me. Brother, think of this. I have seen her daily. She has grown up beside me and has become a part of my soul." "And she shall be thine," he exclaimed, "thine! I may not wrong thee, nor will I do so. I also love her, but tomorrow I depart. In a year we will see each other again, but then you will be married. Shall it not be so? I have a little gold of my own. It shall be yours. You must and shall take it." We wandered silently homeward across the mountains. It was late in the evening when we reached my mother's door. Anastasia held the lamp as we entered. My mother was not there. She looked at Aphantides with a sweet but mournful expression on her face.
"Tomorrow you are going to leave us," she said. "I am very sorry."
"Sorry?" he exclaimed, and his voice was troubled with a grief as deep as my own. I could not speak, but he seized her hand and said, "Our brother yonder loves you, and is he not dear to you? His very silence now proves his affection." Anastasia trembled and burst into tears. Then I saw no one and thought of none but her. I threw my arms around her and pressed my lips to hers. As she flung her arms around my neck, the lamp fell to the ground, and we were in darkness, dark as the heart of poor Aphantides. Before daybreak he rose, kissed us all, and said farewell, and went away. He had given all his money to my mother for us. Anastasia was betrothed to me, and in a few days afterwards she became my wife. The Swineherd. Once upon a time lived a poor prince. His kingdom was very small, but it was large enough to enable him to marry, and marry he would. It was rather bold of him that he went and asked the emperor's daughter, "Will you marry me?" But he ventured to do so, for his name was known far and wide, and there were hundreds of princesses who would have gladly accepted him. But would she do so? Now we shall see. On the grave of the prince's father grew a rose tree, the most beautiful of its kind. It bloomed only once in 5 years, and then it had only one single rose upon it. But what a rose! It had such a sweet scent that one instantly forgot all sorrow and grief when one smelt it. He also had a nightingale which could sing as if every sweet melody was in its throat. This rose and the nightingale he wished to give to the princess, and therefore both were put into big silver cases and sent to her. The emperor ordered them to be carried into the great hall where the princess was just playing "Visitors Are Coming" with her ladies-in-waiting. When she saw the large cases with the presents therein, she clapped her hands for joy.
"I wish it were a little pussy-cat," she said, but then the rose tree with the beautiful rose was unpacked.
"Oh, how nicely it is made!"
exclaimed the ladies.
"It is more than nice," said the emperor. "It is charming." The princess touched it and nearly began to cry.
"For shame, Pa," she said. "It is not artificial. It is natural."
"For shame, it is natural," repeated all her ladies.
"Let us first see what the other case contains before we are angry,"
said the emperor. Then the nightingale was taken out, and it sang so beautifully that no one could possibly say anything unkind about it.
"Superbe, charmant,"
said the ladies of the court, for they all prattled French, one worse than the other.
"How much the bird reminds me of the musical box of the late lamented Empress,"
said an old courtier.
"It has exactly the same tone, the same execution."
"You are right,"
said the emperor, and began to cry like a little child.
"I hope it's not natural,"
said the princess. "Yes, certainly it's natural," replied those who had brought the presents.
"Then let it fly,"
said the princess, and refused to see the prince. But the prince was not discouraged. He painted his face, put on common clothes, pulled his cap over his forehead, and came back.
"A good day, Emperor," he said. "Could you not give me some employment at the court?"
"There are so many,"
replied the emperor.
who apply for places that for the present I have no vacancy, but I will remember you. But wait a moment, it just comes to my mind. I require somebody to look after my pigs, for I have a great many."
Thus the prince was appointed imperial swineherd, and as such he lived in the wretchedly small room near the pigsty. There he worked all day long, and when it was night he made a pretty little pot. There were little bells round the rim, and when the water began to boil in it, the bells began to play the old tune. "A jolly old sow once lived in the sty, 3 little piggies had she." But what was more wonderful was that, when one put a finger into the steam rising from the pot, one could at once smell what meals they were preparing on every fire in the whole town. That was indeed much more remarkable than the rose. When the princess with her ladies passed by and heard the tune, she stopped and looked quite pleased, for she also could play it. In fact, it was the only tune she could play, and she played it with one finger.
"That is a tune I know," she exclaimed. "He must be a well-educated swineherd. Go and ask him how much the instrument is."
One of the ladies had to go and ask, but she put on pattens.
"What will you take for your pot?"
asked the lady. "I will have 10 kisses from the princess," said the swineherd.
"Oh, God forbid," said the lady.
"Well, I cannot sell it for less," replied the swineherd.
"What did he say?"
said the princess.
"Oh, I really cannot tell you,"
replied the lady.
"Well, you can whisper it into my ear." "It is very naughty,"
said the princess, and walked off. But when she had gone a little distance, the bells rang again so sweetly. "A jolly old sow once lived in a sty, 3 little piggies had she."
"Ask him," said the princess, "if he will be satisfied with 10 kisses from one of my ladies."
"No, thank you," said the swineherd. 10 kisses from the princess, or I keep my pot."
"That is tiresome," said the princess, "but you must stand before me so that nobody can see it."
The ladies placed themselves in front of her and spread out their dresses, and she gave the swineherd 10 kisses and received the pot. That was a pleasure. Day and night the water in the pot was boiling. There was not a single fire in the whole town of which they did not know what was preparing on it, the chamberlains as well as the shoemakers. The ladies danced and clapped their hands for joy.
"We know who will eat soup and pancakes. We know who will eat porridge and cutlets. Oh, how interesting!" "Very interesting indeed," said the mistress of the household. "But you must not betray me, for I am the emperor's daughter." "Of course not," they all said.
The swineherd, that is to say, the prince, but they did not know otherwise than that he was a real swineherd, did not waste a single day without doing something. He made a rattle which, when turned quickly round, played all the waltzes, galops, and polkas known since the creation of the world.
"But that is superb," said the princess passing by. "I have never heard a more beautiful composition. Go down and ask him what the instrument costs, but I shall not kiss him again." "He will have 100 kisses from the princess," said the lady who had gone down to ask him. "I believe he is mad," said the princess, and walked off, but soon she stopped. "One must encourage art," she said. "I am the emperor's daughter. Tell him I will give him 10 kisses as I did the other day. The remainder one of my ladies can give him." "But we do not like to kiss him," said the ladies. "That is nonsense," said the princess. "If I can kiss him, you can also do it. Remember that I give you food and employment."
And with that, the lady had to go down once more. 100 kisses from the princess," said the swineherd, "or everybody keeps his own."
"Place yourselves before me,"
said the princess then. They did as they were bidden, and the princess kissed him. "I wonder what the crowd near the pigsty means," said the emperor, who had just come out on his balcony. He rubbed his eyes and put his spectacles on. "The ladies of the court are up to some mischief, I think. I shall have to go down and see." He pulled up his shoes, for they were down at the heels, and he was very quick about it. When he had come down into the courtyard, he walked quite softly, and the ladies were so busily engaged in counting the kisses that all should be fair, that they did not notice the emperor. He raised himself on tiptoe. "What does this mean?" he said, when he saw that his daughter was kissing the swineherd, and then hit their heads with his shoe just as the swineherd received the 68th kiss. "Go out of my sight," said the emperor, for he was very angry, and both the princess and the swineherd were banished from the empire. There she stood and cried. The swineherd scolded her, and the rain came down in torrents.
"Alas, unfortunate creature that I am," said the princess. "I wish I had accepted the prince. Oh, how wretched am I!"
The swineherd went behind a tree, wiped his face, threw off his poor attire, and stepped forth in his princely garments. He looked so beautiful that the princess could not help bowing to him. "I have now learned to despise you," he said. "You refused an honest prince. You did not appreciate the rose and the nightingale, but you did not mind kissing a swineherd for his toys. You have no one but yourself to blame." And then he returned into his kingdom and left her behind. She could now sing at her leisure.
"A jolly old sow once lived in a sty, 3 little piggies has she."
Thanks again for stopping in and sharing your time with us. We hope that you've enjoyed all the stories contained in this, Volume 8 of the Fairy Tales of Hans Christian Andersen. Of course, we have many, many more volumes ahead of us, so please continue to show up, please continue to listen, and please continue to enjoy. Until next time, sweet dreams.